All right, well, we ended class on Wednesday night, if memory serves me correctly, talking about the sorry, um, talking about the people crossing the Red Sea as on dry land. And we talked about, I was trying to impress upon us the significance of that miracle. And then it's followed by another miracle, one we've mentioned before in class, that we've talked about a little bit. I talked about how much it must not have made sense to the children of Israel when God told them to march around the city of Jericho once a day for 6 days and 7 times on the seventh day, and then to blow trumpets and shout, and that the walls of Jericho would come tumbling down. And so by faith, verse 30 says, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. And so we've talked about that particular example and the faith that Israel showed. And one of the reasons why I keep mentioning things like it must not have made sense is because I think sometimes when we think things like that, and maybe I don't think I'm alone. I think we all have feelings like that when we read things from Scripture, or when we have instructions from God. There are times when we look at it and we think that just doesn't make any sense. But I think it's okay to acknowledge that, and I don't think that is a sign of a lack of faith. I think we look at it and we think, well, if I think any way other than what God thinks, then that's a lack of faith. No, if you think that there's something that doesn't make sense, and then you act on that, you act on what you think makes sense instead of what God, that's a lack of faith and a lack of faithfulness. We usually would describe that as faithfulness, but it's the same thing. I mean, when we look at the Old Testament, when we look at Hebrews 3, disobedience and disbelief are interconnected. And so faith, from the perspective of the way that the Bible views it, is not just the idea of, well, I don't believe that doesn't make any sense to me, and so therefore you don't have faith. If you believe that it doesn't make any sense to you and you still do it, then what is that? That's faith. That's trusting God and saying, okay, this doesn't make any sense to me. I would do this a different way. I think I should do it this way. But nevertheless, think about it. I think it's Luke 5. Jesus comes to Peter and John, or Peter and Andrew, and James and John. They're all in the boats. Peter and Andrew and James and John have been fishing all night long. Did they know that lake very well? Or the sea, depending on what you call it. Lake of Gennesaret, Sea of Galilee, same body of water. Did they know that body of water pretty well? Yeah, they'd been fishing it their whole lives. They fished all night long, and what did they caught? Nothing. And yet, this man from Nazareth, a carpenter's son, standing on the beach, preaching to a bunch of people, and they come back in from fishing all night. He uses their boat for a little while, and then he says, cast your nets on the other side. And what does Peter say? That's exactly right. The first thing he does is he points out, we've been fishing all night, and we haven't caught a thing. What does that say? What's he saying? I mean, really, put it in simple terms. It's pretty easy. We're wasting our time. We've been doing this all night long, Lord. We know what we're doing. We've been doing this all night long. It would be a waste of time for us to cast our nets again. But what does he go on to say? But nevertheless, at your word, I'll do it. And what does he do? He does it. And what do they get? Big catch of fish. So my point is, I think sometimes we think when we waver and we think, well, that doesn't make any sense to me, or I think I should do it this way, or, whatever it is. We think those things and we think, that is a lack of faith. No, that's not a lack of faith. That's juggling. That's you juggling your mind and God's mind and what God said and wrestling with it. That's okay. God doesn't mind if we wrestle with things. But in the end, what's He want us to do? I heard it. He wants us to trust Him. And then the other person said, He wants us to obey Him. And that's right. But the two of those go hand in hand. So here it is, Jericho. God says, okay, you see this great big city with all these massive walls? You want to conquer it, right? I'm going to give it to you. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to build a bunch of siege engines and go up against it, and you're going to battle those walls, and you're going to knock them down, and you're going to take that city. Does that make sense? To every military strategy that's ever gone against walls before, that makes perfect sense. Is that what God says? No. God says, okay, so Joshua, here's what you're going to do. Today, I want you to take the entire army of Israel and in silence march around that city. And tomorrow we'll take the siege engine. No, tomorrow, you're going to get up in the morning and you're going to march around that city another time in complete silence. And then the third day, no, you're going to march around the city again. Day 4, day 5, day 6. And then the 7th day, here it is. This is the bad. We're just psyching them out. No. Day 7, you're going to march around the city 7 times. Then you're going to blow a bunch of trumpets. And then you're going to shout. And the walls are just going to fall down. Does it make any sense? No. But what does Joshua and Israel do? They do exactly what God said, and at the end of it all, what happens? The walls, come on. The walls, no, they don't fall. What do? There you go, Angie. The walls came tumbling down. We've sung it since we were kids. The walls come tumbling down. And so, it's just this amazing miracle. Were there doubts? I have no doubt there were doubts. If not in Joshua, certainly in some of the Israelites. They're people, for crying out loud. People, there are things we look at and they don't make any sense to us. And what do we think? Because we're all so smart, right? I've got a better way. But we can think that as much as we want to, as long as at the end we're just like Peter and just like Israel, and we say, okay, this doesn't make any sense, and I think it's a great big waste of time, but nevertheless, at your word, I'll do it. Because we recognize that although it doesn't make any sense to us, the God who has told us is worthy of trust, and we ought to just give in and do it His way. How's it been working for us to do it our way, by the way? It's horribly. We mess it up at every turn. There may be a few things we look at and we do our way and we go, that worked out pretty well. But overall, when we're in charge of our lives, it doesn't go so well. So you and I haven't been doing such a great job of running this show ourselves. So maybe trust somebody who has a track record for pointing people in the right direction and of providing success. And so, that really is what it boils down to, is it not? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And so there are lots of things we haven't seen. There are lots of things we haven't even experienced in this life, much less in the life to come and in the realm that we can't even see. But the point is, God has earned the right for us to trust Him, especially when it doesn't make sense. Because when it makes sense, that's easy, right? When God's way of doing something lines up with what I think makes sense, well, that's easy. That's not hard at all. I thought I would do it that way anyway, so it's nice that God wants me to do it that way. But when God's way and my way don't line up, that's where faith comes in. And it's okay to say, no. We can say that, we can think that, but in the end, like Israel, we're going to march around the city, we're going to blow some trumpets, and we're going to shout. I love Robert Turner's telling of this story, because he goes through this big, long, extravagant explanation for what they did. he's talking to this guy on an airplane, and the guy says, is trying to talk to him about scientific proofs and different things. And Robert Turner essentially asks him, do you think that the Israelites, all those 650,000 people, 600, it's actually 603,000 and change, those marching men marching around the city, do you think that the seismic waves created by them marching around the city all those times was what ultimately shook the foundation stones and made the walls fall? And that guy said, no, that's ridiculous. Robert Turner said, I agree. And so he talks about them marching around the city all those times. And then they blew the trumpets, and he says, it was all over but the shouting. Because that's true, right? I mean, they marched around the city all those times. They blew the trumpets, and where are the walls? Still right where they were when they started. But then they shouted. Also, it was the sound waves created by all the noise from the shouting, right? No. They had finally done all that God had called on them to do, and so what happened? What God promised. The walls fell. The walls came tumbling down, and they marched up into the city and they took it. So by faith they did that. Okay, somebody else was there at Jericho and is also mentioned by faith. Who's that? Yeah, and it's interesting because this is the one where the one of the first ones that if you looked at it just on the surface, it looks like, oh, well, Rahab's mentioned, but it's in kind of a passive sense. She did not perish with those who were disobedient. But then you go on and it says, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Now, this one always brings up a debate. Why is that? Because Rahab is held up as an example of faith for doing what? For protecting the spies, but Samantha's putting it way too nicely. What'd she do? She lied. So this one always brings up a debate. Because Rahab is held up as an example of faith, but Rahab lied. And it is her lying, in essence, that, as people look at it, is held up as the example of faith. She here in this case welcomed the spies, but what does she go on to do? She protects them by lying. So she welcomes the spies, and then she protects them from the people who are looking for them in Jericho. And she does that by lying. And so we have a real problem with that. We look at that and we say, yeah, but she's held up for her faith, but she lied. So what do you do with that? Well, I mean, there are a couple of things you can do with it. I know what I've done with it previously. What do you do with that? Crickets. You leave it up to God? Well, I mean, it's clear that she is, from God's perspective, I mean, God's the one that's writing this book, right? She is faithful. But the debate always revolves around, so is she commended for lying? In which case, it becomes a matter of somewhat of situation ethics, which has made some of us uncomfortable before. But I recently had someone that I consider a really good Bible student who has essentially, with this passage, seen it as, in some ways, justification. And you can do what you want with this. I'm still kind of wrestling with it myself. But, for example, this individual was talking about the fact that if someone broke into their home and they had hidden their children and the person asked if they were home alone, they would say yes, in order to protect their children. And so their way of looking at it was, in an instance where I am seeking to protect someone else, not myself, because clearly there are instances where we might be called on to stand with Christ as an individual or die. And what should we do in those instances? We should stand with Christ, even if it means our death. How do we know that? What was it, Samantha? What did you say? Okay, I mean, Dan said we see the rest of the chapter. Samantha said we're told if we deny Christ, he will deny us. You've got both of those. We have lots of examples of people who, when it was their own personal safety that was at stake, stood with the Lord and suffered the consequences, right? But so this person that I'm talking about, that I consider a really good Bible student, their thought is, and in somewhat based on passages like this, but we see other instances too, clearly when Abraham had Sarah lie, and he lied to protect himself, is that a good idea? And we say, well, he did. Some of us would say, well, he didn't really lie. It was just a half-truth. Oh, come on. Are we going to split hairs like that? He was doing it to protect himself. And so this person's feeling, based on this passage and others, is if it's an instance where we're protecting others, perhaps there are occasions when it's okay to do things like this. Was Rahab protecting herself? No, in fact, she would have been held up as a hero of Jericho if she'd given the spies over, right? She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting the spies. And the end result was she did end up preserving her family, right? Well, I mean, from the perspective of the people of Jericho, did they think the Israelites had a chance against their big walled city? Psh, no way. Rahab did. Why? Oh, give it to me. It's right here in Hebrews. Why did Rahab believe that Israel had a chance against Jericho? Because she had faith. It's that simple. It's that simple. She had faith. Now, we might, because this is the way I've looked at it before, I have typically looked at it as she lied. God would have preserved these men anyway, right? She didn't need to lie. That's how I've always looked at it. But the reason she lied was because she had faith. She had already, as far as the situation went, she had already given herself over to the Lord, and she had already sided with Israel because she had faith. Now, we could say her lie was misplaced, that she should have tried to come up with a different way. But here's a woman she's been a pagan her whole life, living in a wicked city that's about to be destroyed because of their sin. Did I take what your point was? She's been a pagan her whole life. She's been in a city that's about to be destroyed because of their sin. And she comes up with the best thing she can on the spur of the moment. And so she says, oh, well, they went this way. If you go this way, you'll catch them. And then she lets them out in a different way. So, I mean, like I said, I throw it out to you not because I'm necessarily convinced myself, but just something to wrestle with. And again, it goes back to, some of you I know just look at it and say, well, God says Rahab's faithful. That's enough. To me, I read some of those, because there's another one that's in here that I struggle with. That's just a verse or so later. Go ahead, Jim.
Told a lie through life a few times, you know.
Yes.
Revelation 21:8 says all liars will have their part in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is a second death.
Yes.
But there won't be a single liar in hell who gets God's forgiveness when he leaves here.
Yes. And I mean, the difference is, a liar is what? What is a liar? It's a habitual, it's a practice. I mean, they are people who don't tell the truth. Do we think Rahab was a liar? No, I mean, she lied. I mean, I'm okay with using lie here. Does that make her a liar? No. She was a harlot. Was, right? And she ultimately became what? She became a wife and a mother. And not just any mother. She's in the lineage of Jesus. So, I mean, she was a lot of things. But this was the beginning of her turning to the Lord. And we certainly believe, on the basis of what we see in Scripture, Joyce has something. What we see in Scripture, that there were a lot of other things that changed about Rahab over the course of her life too, just like there are for all of the faithful. But she's listed here as a person of faith. Who does? Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Joyce was just pointing that out.
Throughout the scriptures, I don't see anywhere that it's condoned, that her lie was condoned at all, or her being a prostitute.
Right.
It's just the point of that whole thing is that she had enough faith, not that she was not doing anything wrong in the way she handled it.
Right.
It was just her faith. I think if she lied, she was a liar. That's what I believe.
Yeah.
But she didn't have to do it habitually to be a liar, because God hates that. He hates the lie.
Right. Well, and faith always begins how? Do we begin with knowing everything? No. I mean, nobody really starts out that way. We all begin by knowing a little bit and by beginning to trust God, and then we grow in that relationship throughout life, right? So there were lots of things Rahab didn't understand at this point, but she did understand that she had witnessed, or had heard about at least, that God had done great things for Israel throughout their whole journey on the way to Jericho. And she trusted enough to know that if God had given them victory over the kings on the other side of the river, that God was going to give them victory here too. And so she trusted in that, and was willing to live by that amount of trust. And then as she committed herself to the Lord later, which she clearly did, grew in lots of other ways too. It has always been a little bit of a shock to me that when Rahab is mentioned, she is always referred to how? Rahab the harlot, or Rahab the prostitute. And I think I actually think, although it's shocking, and you think, well, Rahab probably didn't want to be remembered for that the rest of her life, but there are a couple things that it does. One, it identifies specifically which person we're talking about. But I think more importantly than that, it reminds us of where she came from. Do all of us have a past? Yes. Are we proud of our past? No. And she wasn't proud of hers either. But it was her past, and it shows from where God had brought her. And then we see in other passages, like the passage in Matthew, in the genealogy of Jesus, we see how far she had come and how far she had risen, right? And that is the result of God. And God can do that in anybody's life. It doesn't matter how low you are, doesn't matter how low you begin, God can do great things with people no matter what kind of mess they've gotten their life into. And that is a beautiful thing. Then we've got this list of the people during the times of the judges and a little beyond. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel. There's a name that's there in the midst of those that always gives me a little bit of pause. Oh yeah, it is Samson. Because I look at Samson's life. Oh yeah, I mean he would be held up as the epitome of masculinity in our country, because he was a man's man, right? I mean, he needed something done, he just did it with his own two hands. So he would be held up from that perspective in our society. But when you look at the example of Samson and all that he did, what do you think? This is what I think. But what does this passage say? And I know, I mean, people say, well, but at the very end, right? Because what does he do? He prays to God, and he pulls the temple of Dagon down and kills more Philistines in his death than he did in his life, right? I know how I feel about that whole point, though. But anyway, the point is, what does this passage say? Samson is what? He's faithful. He's an example of faith. And I mean, I do think in some ways it helps to remember the period of the Judges. It was just a stellar period in the history of Israel, right? A lot of great examples of faith during that time. No, I mean, it's categorized twice by a statement that says everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. And it's suggested because there was no king. But, I mean, we see, again, when they did get a king, they didn't do so great with that either. So, but then we've got David and Samuel. And then we've got this whole group of people who are not even named. And we see some statements that are made that make us think about specific people, like whom? Shut the mouths of lions. Daniel. I mean, could it have been other people? Sure. But we know the story from Daniel chapter 6 of Daniel in the lion's den, right? And the mouths of the lions were stopped, and they didn't eat Daniel that night. And then the next day, when the king throws those wicked counselors into the lion's den, they're devoured immediately, right? So it wasn't because the lions weren't hungry, it was because God was with him. So stop the mouths of lions, that we see Daniel. Who else? I hadn't really noticed this one. I don't know why. I've read this passage who knows how many times. I hadn't really noticed this one until this time around. I know, I'm asking you to read my mind. What are some others you see that remind you of people that you know? Okay, so we've got the people who hid in caves, and during the days of Elijah, there were lots of prophets that were hiding in caves because of Ahab and Jezebel. What else? Anybody else that's in there that... I'm not looking for obscure ones. There's one that says they were sawn in two, and there is a historical statement that says that historically it's believed that Isaiah was sawn in two. I'm not looking for extra biblical stuff. I'm looking for things that are mentioned here that remind us of things we read about in Scripture. There's one right after stopping the mouths of lions that I think is interesting. It's the one that I hadn't seen before, or at least it didn't cause me pause. Quench the power of fire. Who might that make you think of? Yeah. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I don't like to call them by their Babylonian names. That's just me. So the three Hebrew friends of Daniel, we could on a technicality say, well, they didn't really quench the fire. The fire was still roaring, but what happened? They were in the midst of it and they weren't burned. It sounds like quenching fire to me. So I just, like I said, I hadn't really noticed that one before. I don't know why. And it may not be talking about them at all. It may be some other instance. But anyway, so we've got this list of people based on things that they did by faith, but there are no names. What does that do for us? Dan mentioned this a little bit, I think, he said this was his favorite part of Hebrews. Why might it be a part of Hebrews that would appeal to us? Okay, what is the likelihood that history is going to record my name? That generations from now, people are going to read about my triumphs. Oh, you're not going to hurt my feelings. I've made my peace with it a long time ago. Nobody's going to know me. I'm going to be doing good if a few generations from now even my own family thinks much about me. I mean, seriously, that's the facts. But who is going to know me? God knows me. And He'll know what I did. He'll know the good, the bad, and the ugly. But He'll know the things that I did because I had faith in Him. They may not matter to everybody else, but they matter to Him. And that is why this is also a favorite portion of mine, because I'm not going to be Samson or Barak or David or Samuel or Moses or Abraham or any of those guys. I'm not going to be one of those guys that generations of people later look at and say, now there was a man of faith. But God knows, and that's what matters. And the other thing is, when you look at this, not just that God knows who I am and knows what I've accomplished by faith, but what we see is the great things that God can accomplish in no-name people. It's one of the reasons Acts chapter 11 is one of my favorite chapters, the last half of that chapter. It's actually about the beginning of the church at Antioch in Syria. And it's one of my favorites because the church at Antioch in Syria becomes a really important church, not from the standpoint of the fact that it's renowned in history, but because it becomes the base from which Paul and Barnabas and then Paul and Silas move out from to take the gospel to the far reaches of the earth. And so it becomes a really important city and a really important church from the perspective of sending out people to preach the gospel all over the place. And the reason I like the chapter is because when you read the chapter, the church at Antioch in Syria was not started by Paul. It wasn't started by Barnabas. It wasn't started by Peter or James or Andrew or any of the other apostles. It was started by a bunch of no-name men who just happened to go to that area and start preaching the gospel to whoever would hear it. And the end result was that men and women believed, and they were baptized into Christ, and the church began. So they were no-name people. God can do great things, amazing things with no names. Aaron.
Kind of along that point, Thursday and Friday, I got the privilege to spend 2 days with the Zig Ziglar Corporation, their leaders and coaches. And one of the teachings that Zig Ziglar had was very few people will make a splash, but anyone can make a ripple through eternity. And it's through our faith. And when we see this, hall of faith, just like you said, very few of us, probably none of us, are going to be remembered, 1,000 years from now, even 100 years from now.
Right.
But every one of us have the opportunity to make a ripple that will last, in our case, through eternity.
Right.
It's by our faith, and that's what we see in Hebrews, is, an active faith. And by faith, all these things that were done create a long-lasting ripple that will last for eternity.
Yeah, we think about, I think sometimes we get enamored by big preachers who have a big name. They've done a lot of good work, and we know they've started churches and baptized a lot of people. And yet the reality is there are some people that you have no idea who they are, that just by simply sharing their life and the truth of the gospel have reached perhaps more people in some ways than those individuals. Because as Aaron said, that ripple effect takes effect. And so they teach these people, and these people teach more people. And some people that didn't even know the first person who started the ripple, they're teaching other people. And so it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. It's kind of like the way that Abraham, from one child, Isaac, becomes the father of the nation of Israel, and by Ishmael becomes the father of the Arabic peoples. And so, you've just got all of these people that came from Abraham. And so in the same way, a small ripple can make a a huge impact across the world and certainly across eternity, as Aaron said. Yes, sir.
I think this passage, this whole chapter, serves a really important function for the author to the people reading it, because he's dealing with their difficulty in adopting the new covenant. They're having trouble leaving behind the old covenant and transitioning to the new. And in that process, you can understand how someone who was a Jew might say, how am I supposed to look back at all these people and what, they died for nothing? You know, they had faith for nothing because that old covenant's being done away with. And by bringing up all these people, and even these unnamed people who were imprisoned and who were afflicted, who were mistreated, those kind of words probably would have set off bells in their heads. Well, people in their family probably experienced that. People in their very recent memory would have experienced
Right.
that. So it makes it much more personal to them. And in holding up all of those examples and praising those examples as they had a faith, and it was the right faith, the author of Hebrews is making sure that they are not discounting the faith that came before them. And, you know, the faith of your ancestors and the faith of
important.
God's people was important, and it served a purpose. But he still ends the chapter 11 with, and all that given, there's something better for you.
Right.
So it's serving a dual purpose. It's don't think that I'm just, you know, trashing anything that came before.
Right.
You don't need to just forget about Moses. Worthless, you know, gone, doesn't matter anymore. God uses the faith of his people in that previous covenant, and that those lessons don't end when the covenant does.
Right.
They're still there. That's it.
Well, and I mean, you know, you said he says that apart from us, there was something better promised for us. But what else does he go on to say at the very end of the chapter in verse 40? Or not, is it? Yeah, verse 40. God provided something better for us. That, go on to the rest of the end of the verse. That apart from us, they should not be what? Should not be made perfect. That apart from us. So, but now that the better has come, that the promised has come, what is true for them? It's right there. That apart from us, they should not be made perfect. So now that the better has come and we can be made perfect, what happens with them? No. They weren't just cast off. It wasn't like, well, you just happened to be born at the wrong time, so sorry about your luck, you can't be perfected. No, they couldn't be perfected apart from us. But now that the better has come, now that the promise has arrived, we can be perfected, and they are perfected. And so we're perfected together. So they're brought into this. And we saw that back in chapter 9 too. Remember, those who committed trespasses under the first covenant received forgiveness, not from the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, but from the blood of Christ. So we are all perfected together through Christ. It is Him that perfects us. So part of what was pointed out in Hebrews chapter 11, back in verses 13 through 16, was Abraham living for now? Oh, poor pitiful Abraham if he was. No, he wasn't living for now. He was living for a city whose builder and maker is God. Did he get that city? Yes. How? Because he left Mesopotamia and went to Canaan? Because he took Isaac up on the mountain? By faith, but through whom does Abraham have that city? Through Jesus. It wasn't through Melchizedek. Through one like Melchizedek, but it's through Jesus. So Abraham's perfected through Christ. Moses perfected through Christ. Oh, I didn't know you had the microphone. So all of them are perfected through Christ, just as we are perfected through Christ, which is why, beginning of chapter 12, He's going to remind us again of this great cloud of witnesses. But then who's he going to tell us to fix our eyes on? Who are we going to fix our eyes on while we run this race? Jesus. He's the one to keep your eye on. He's the one to keep your focus on, because he's the one that has already completed the race. He completed it for all of us so that we could be where he is. So we'll start by looking again at the last couple of verses of chapter 11 and then rolling into chapter 12. And that way, if Greg still remembers his point, I'll let him make it then. I didn't know he had the microphone.